Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name is Ivana Harenku if you're new here, and if you're not, thank you for coming back. Today is Friday. It is July the 8th, and today we're talking about elections. Now, we know that the general election is coming up in November. We have a little bit of time for that, but we're actually talking about primaries today. We know that we just got finished with primaries in Alabama recently, with those primaries in May, and then those runoffs at the end of June. Today, I am joined by our reporter, John Sharp, and he's here today to talk a little bit about those primaries and why some politicians, primarily Alabama Republicans, are wanting to change primary rules and take our primaries to what is called a closed primary versus an open primary. John, there's a lot of information here. We could get really weedy, but why don't we start just saying what's the difference in a closed primary and an open primary in Alabama?
So the biggest difference would be in an open primary is what we have currently, where you can walk in on the primary day and you are asked which ballot you would like to vote on, Republican or Democrat, or neither, if there's for instance, a referendum to vote on. And you make that decision when you walk into the ballot, into the polling place, and then you go vote, you hand in your ballot, and off you go. In a closed primary, however, you have to be pre-registered with the political party in order to participate in that election. And right now, that's the discussion that's going to be occurring most likely in the spring legislative session of next year on whether or not Alabama should go from what it's currently, a long time has been an open primary to what is described as a closed primary.
Well, in a closed primary, as you just mentioned, is that you have to register as either a Democrat or Republican before that day. Right now, you can come in and say, I'm going to vote in Republican primary today. You couldn't do that in a closed primary. And a lot of states do have closed primaries. So, John, tell us why some states prefer closed primaries and why some Alabama Republicans are really pushing for the state to become a closed primary state.
The biggest issue, from what was told to me while I was doing the reporting in this story, is the concern about Democratic influence in a Republican primary. For instance, you would have large what they call crossover voters from Democratic voters that walk in on the election day and decide, well, I want to try and influence a particular the particular outcome of a race, and they pull a Republican ballot and they vote however they wish to vote. It's caused some concerns in a particular state Senate race involving Senator Tom Whatley, which he lost by one vote. And the part of that, the fallout from that is that there was actually a professor at Auburn University who wrote a op-ed to the New York Times saying, she's a Democrat, but she decided to vote in that Republican primary in order to influence the outcome of that election because she did not like the incumbent senator. Not to say that she was the only one who did that. There was probably others. But that particular election caused enough concerns from Republicans to say, hey, wait a minute, we really ought to look at closing this up, making sure that, if you are voting in our election, that you are registered as a Republican before the actual primary occurs. So that's kind of where things are at right now.
John, I think so many people take pride, or at least like to say that they take pride in American elections because you can vote for who you want. And again, put away that party affiliation. You can vote for your candidate. And that is the American process, right? Or at least on paper, that's the American process. That people, citizens who are eligible to vote, can vote their candidate in, and then they have a say in the way that our government is run, right? So what do these Alabama Republicans and other people who are in support of closed primaries, what do they say to that argument, and about how it wouldn't be really a whole lot of voters who are making those big decisions?
Yeah, the argument against closed primaries is it could lead to and we saw it in this particular primary, a pretty low voter turnout and voter participation. And so that's kind of the argument against the closed primaries. But in support of it is that there's nothing stopping a voter to go register as a Republican. A Democratic voter could walk in and register as a Republican. There's nothing that's stopping that individual from doing so. So that's it. The argument can be that even though that we're going to a closed primary, it still can be, you still can participate in it, but you have to register ahead of time as either a Republican or Democrat. And so certainly there'll be an educational component if this goes through. Right now, it does have the momentum. The Alabama State Republican Party really wants this. Some Republican state lawmakers are acknowledge that fact, and it's likely that there's going to be legislation drawn up and probably advanced through committee and into the chambers of the House and the Senate next session. But there will be opposition to this. There will potentially be national opposition to it. There's organizations called Open Primary. There's an organization, a nonprofit called Open Primaries. They're out of New York, and they're kind of a watchdog group that kind of is tracking these efforts to move from open to closed nationwide. There's probably about a half dozen states in the U.S. that are considering this move right now. Only one state since 2013 has actually gone from open to closed primaries, and that's the state of Idaho. There are other states that have gone the other direction. The state of Maine, for instance, went from closed to partial opening. What I mean by that is they allow independent voters to participate in their primary. And there's a lot of independent voters, or more independent voters, arguably, in the state of Maine than there probably are in a state like Alabama, which is heavily either Democratic or Republican. So, yeah, we can get in the weeds and all that, but it just seems like right now there is some momentum in other states other than Alabama to go from this direction of open to closed primaries. Some of that stems from the 2020 presidential election. Some of that stems, for instance, in the state of Georgia. They're pitching this right now. They had their primaries in which the Secretary of State there, Brad Raffensperger, is supposedly received a lot of Democratic crossover votes and defeated a candidate he was running against in a statewide contest that was endorsed by former President Donald Trump. So a lot of issues at play there. Here in the state of Alabama, the state Alabama Republican Party has pushed for this in the past, so it wasn't just a 2022 phenomena. It has been supported by the state party before, but it's really been amplified after this particular primary season with some questionable outcomes that have occurred in some tight races, including one that resulted in the defeat of an incumbent state senator in the Auburn, Lee County area.
You've mentioned several instances here that Republicans specifically have pointed to and blamed crossover voting, essentially, or blamed open primaries for. But I haven't heard any examples that you've used or seen any also readily available that show any examples of Democrats saying that they are upset with Republicans voting in their primaries. So is that a non-issue here, or what's the deal here? Why are people only citing these Republican primaries as the issue for closed primaries?
Yeah, lately that seems to be the case, but there are examples, and I did talk to the head of the Open Primaries organization. He cited the state of Nevada, where Democrats have been a little bit more hesitant to going towards from a closed to open primary, largely because there's a Democratic, I hate to use the word machine, but there's a Democratic establishment that has roots dating back to Senator Harry Reid, that are in opposition of moving in that direction. So it's not necessarily a Democrat versus Republican phenomena, although it does seem to be being pushed more lately by Republicans in some of these very strong Republican states, like Alabama, where voters show up on the primary day. For instance, here in Baldwin County, a very heavily Republican state. If you want to decide who your leaders are going to be going forward, the primary is the time to do so. Not necessarily a general election, because almost 9.9 out of 10 times the Republican is going to win that election. And that very limited time, it very rarely comes. Yeah, the elections for the most part is determined in the primaries, and that's the argument that folks that support open primaries make, is that by closing the primary, you're keeping voters away from determining who should be truly their leaders, because the actual election is determined in the primary.
Right. I think that was a point I was going to make. So I'm glad you bring that up. Especially in a place like Alabama, where there's a Republican supermajority, if you are trying to vote and you're trying to essentially play the politics game, and you're looking at the person instead of necessarily the party, and you say, well, I think candidate A, if I'm going to be, if I say I'm a Democrat and I say, look, I'm going to be stuck with a Republican, likely, let me at least pick the Republican that I prefer to be in that spot. I'm sure that is something that the Democratic Party is thinking about and that the Democratic Party is going to bring up. But that leads us to kind of the next step, John. I know you said that legislation is expected to be introduced coming here in a upcoming legislative session for Alabama. And if it does become introduced by Alabama Republicans, again, we're looking at a supermajority in the House and the Senate in the state. And it looks like that would likely pass. So, what can voters do, or what can the Democratic Party do to stop it?
That's an interesting question. I don't know exactly. Again, the Democratic Party hasn't really weighed in on that. And I did reach out and ask them for a comment. I did not hear back from anyone, but there could be some questions raised during this process. And in the story, I did talk to State Senator Vivian Figures, who said on the surface, it seems like there's some concerns about voter suppression and intimidation. For instance, would Democratic voters be comfortable saying that, well, I'm a Republican, so I'm gonna register as one? That's something that is certainly worth diving into if you're the Democratic Party. Will that prevent their voters from showing up on the primary day? And there's some, certainly that's all issues that'll be raised in the spring. I think of course the legislation hasn't been written or drafted yet. We don't even know if it was approved when the first primary would be, in which this could be the new standard. And of course there would be an educational component, not just with Democratic voters, not just with the Democratic voters, but with Republican voters as well, that they would need to register ahead of time before actually going in to vote during the primary.
Which would probably lead to another cause for low turnout. We know the more work people have to do to vote, the more work people have to do for most anything, the least likely they are going to be to do it. So you add that extra step of registering. And John, you mentioned this earlier. Somebody could say, you know what, I'm going to vote in the Republican primary. Maybe perhaps I have voted in a Democratic primary years before. This time I'm going to vote Republican. You could, in theory, register as a Republican, vote in that Republican primary. But then how easy or how difficult is it to switch your affiliation? Would you be able to switch every primary? And if so, how does that solve any type of problem that Alabama Republicans are identifying?
You're raising a great question. I don't know how that would be handled. I think a lot of this would be administered through the Secretary of State's office. What kind of rules and regulations would they put into play? That has not been determined yet. Again, the legislation has not been drafted. Excellent question that you raised, and I certainly would think that one of our lawmakers would want to raise that too during the debate on this particular legislation. We are in this is kind of a post-primary discussion that's been tossed out there. We haven't had the legislation drafted yet. The legislature does not convene again until I think February. So we're a little ways away before this actually becomes the topic of discussion. There could be other issues that bump up in the level of importance when the legislature convenes. But hard to say where this one might land as far as momentum from the Republican Party goes. But right now it seems like it's gotten a lot of attention because we just ended the primary, and we ended a couple of races that, especially that state Senate race in Lee County, in which there was a lot of attention on it because of the close outcome of the race. Some attention by the New York Times. So yeah, it's on the top of everyone's mind right now. But as far as getting into the nuts and bolts of how this would look for Alabama going forward, it's just a little too early to tell.
And again, John, I think you said too, the legislature does not meet now for several months, possibly, I think you said until next spring. So it could be quite a while before we see any legislation if it does come up as we expect it might. So I guess it's fair to say this is something that we're just going to have to keep our eyes on.
Yeah, definitely. There'll be more stories written about this as we go forward. And again, I think the next step in all this is to see what kind of legislation is drafted. And when that occurs, we'll be able to know more about what this could look like going forward.
And we should also note that, again, that general election is coming up in November. I don't have my calendar in front of me. I believe it is November 8th. And that is something, again, that every registered voter can vote on. You don't have to worry about party affiliation in that as well. And again, this is something that legislation has not quite been drafted yet. So this is more of a hypothetical conversation and a conversation that some of our lawmakers are having, but nothing that is set in stone yet. And I think I interrupted you, John.
No, you're exactly right. And again, this would not touch or affect the general election whatsoever. You don't have to register as a party to show up on the general election. But again, in Alabama, a lot of our local races, our state legislative races, our statewide races, the primary is the main event, and the general election is not. And so that's kind of that's the issue at play here. How much do we want to affect that primary when we don't have competitive general election contests?
Again, that general election is in November. You have some time to read up about those races that will be on the ballot, and we'll have more coverage on that on AL.com, especially coming up to that day, so you can educate yourself about those races before you go and vote. John, thank you so much for all of your information here. This is an interesting topic, and I know one that people have very strong feelings about one way or the other. So, John, thank you for bringing us the latest there. Everybody watching, thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you on Monday.